Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are looking at Norway in the war again and the subject of the transportation of SOE agents back and forth from Scotland to Norway. My guest, Asgeir, or Oscar in English, is probably the premier Shetland Bus historian and has written and lectured extensively on the subject. So it was a few years ago when he was on talking about the Great Escapers. I just watched the clip this morning and realized how much grayer my beard has become in the last 3.5 years. But that's aging. It happens to us all. But I'll bring him in now. So good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. Good to be back with you, Paul. I'm fine, and I hope you're well.
I'm very well. So we were just talking about, your research, and the thing about SOE and O.S.S. and the sort of special operations is that the books written in the 1950s and 60s, maybe some of the people involved, they knew that there was the protection of the official secrets. They knew people that they were writing about had been killed. And it was sort of anything goes in some ways. We have that with the double agents. But since you've been researching the subject for a good decade now, with the release of documentation, with the access to archives, are we in a different position to understand, the Shetland Bus and the SOE now in 2025 to perhaps when you started?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we are moved very far from what you described, from these early books that came in the case of the Shetland Bus that came in the early 50s mainly. One memoir and one biography about one of the most known skippers in the Shetland Bus, Leif Larsen. And with the archives, we also managed to get closer to other skippers and other participants who were left out on these earlier books. Though it has to be said that, all the personnel files at Kew in London, the National Archives, on the Shetland Bus a lot of them are pretty thin. So there's one example with a guy who stayed for nearly 5 years in the operations, and all we have is about 4 sheets, which basically say his education, where he came from, etc. So there are also gaps still, and even the families are not aware of what their grandfathers or fathers did during the war in some cases.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And I was talking to Dr. Kate Vigers a couple of weeks ago about her book on the SOE, and another problem she faced is when is an operation SOE? When does it become like the actual local resistance? When does it become under some other umbrella organization? Because the boundaries are a bit loose, aren't they? When we're looking at conventional ground fighting, we can see here's where, I don't know, the Hampshire Regiment was, and here's where the Dorset Regiment was, and we can see that delineation. But with all this sort of secret underground stuff, you have like advisors, and there's MI5 and MI6, and in the background and MI19, then you've got the various resistance groups. And is it easy to kind of put a certain amount of the precision under what is the Shetland Bus story? Does it get a bit vague?
No, I think the Shetland Bus story is pretty easy compared. You have to remember that Norway in 1940 was a country with 3 million people. And it's very much a face-to-face society in many ways. That you can go back to the old phone books, you can read the old newspapers online, and you can see where people lived, where they were, what they did before the war, etc. So in that sense, Norway is much more easy to research than, say, France or Germany or the Balkans or whatever. We have a pretty good inkling what was going on in Norway. But as you said, also in Norway there were various cases with resistance people, especially in the early years, that they had several hats. They were also part of the local resistance. They worked for the SOE. They were also involved in intelligence in some cases. So that they joined all the organizations as once almost.
Well, if everything in history was neat and able, there'd be no point having historians. If we knew everything and everything was in the right category, there'd be no point for new work. But we digress with the conversation. So I'm gonna hand it over to my guest now. So folks, if you want to have questions, please direct them. But I think most of them will probably be answered as we go on. I'll hand over to my guest, Oscar, to take us through this. So the Shetland Bus, over to you, sir.
Yeah, the Shetland Bus, which is a bit of a misnomer according to the name. It was a name that was brought up by David Howarth in the 50s when he wrote this famous book about the Shetland Bus. He was also a part of the Shetland Bus himself, so it's a kind of vaguely sort of slash biography slash about the men and the crews. And the bus indicates that it was a pretty straightforward thing. A bus comes at given time every hour, and you go back and forth, and it's easy. But as you see in the opening picture here, you see the fleet of fishing boats at Lunabo in the winter of 1941-42. And these fishing boats were not on time. It took a long time to cross the North Sea in winter, also due to storms and heavy weather and gales and everything, and also because these vessels could maximum do about 7 knots per hour. So it was very slow moving. Often they did much less than that. And the bus thing only comes towards the end when the American sub chasers are brought in. We're going to go back to that. But
Right.
if you move one slide ahead, we can see a map of the operations area. You see here vaguely to the right, you see Europe in 1940. It's before the German breakout or the German conquest of Western Europe, obviously. And then you can see you see the UK and see the Norwegian coastline, which is very long. In primary school, we were taught that if you turn Norway upside down, you'll get south to Rome. So it's a pretty long coastline to cover. It would cover nearly the entire European continent on the way. And far to the north of Britain, to top right of Britain, you see Shetland, the islands, which is in the medieval times it used to belong to the Norwegian king, and he was turned over to the Scottish crown when the Scottish king married the Danish princess back in the day. We're not going to get into those details, but we can claim in Norway that they really are ours if we go.
If we start going over which islands in the Atlantic are Norwegian and Danish, we'll be here all day. So
yeah, that's true. So that was way back in time, and it means that a lot of the place names in Shetland are place names you also find in Norway, which is interesting because the linguistic connection is there. Although most of the population in Shetland obviously are descendants of Scottish people and so forth. Our story begins really after the invasion of Poland in 1939, when Section D, which was one of the two predecessors of the SOE, together with MIR, Military Intelligence Research, they amalgamated in summer of 1940 into SOE. So that's the background. But in 1939, the Section D, which was under MI6, sends a delegation to Shetland to explore the possibility to smuggle explosives from Shetland into Sweden via Norway. The reason they explored this possibility was because of the Swedish iron ore, which was very important for the German supplies during the war. They planned to sabotage the iron ore facilities in the Baltic Sea. And also this is where the famous town of Narvik pops up in British history, which is known for its naval battle, etc., during 1940. And the plan was to sabotage these places, but and this operation was prepared in the hamlet of Cullivoe, north on Shetland. Everything was ready, even where the key was to be found if it was needed. And they would use Norwegian fishermen who had come over to fish outside the Shetland waters. It's a place where Norwegians started fishing in the early 20th century. So the waters around Shetland were already well known to Norwegian fishermen, which were to become the backbone of the Shetland Bus people.
Yeah.
And when this operation didn't happen, the real start is the Battle of Norway in 1940. Southern Norway capitulates in early May 1940, and there is disorderly retreat of British forces. Some British forces are brought back to the UK via the Navy, but there are a lot of British soldiers that are stuck in Norway and can't get back to the UK. So they walk around the mountains. Some head for Sweden, which is close to the border to the east. Others head for the coast, where they try to buy a place on a Norwegian fishing vessel by offering an extensive amount of money for a fisherman to take them over to Shetland or to Scotland. And you know, the you know, it's a bit weak in the table because it's a bit small picture, but if you see the amounts of money, you're talking about, you know, quite a substantial lot of money compared to what a Norwegian fisherman would earn in 1940. And the deal was, okay, you take us over to Shetland, which is, say, 24 to 48 hours sailing, you get your money and you go back home again. And lo and behold, when they arrive in Shetland, they refuse to go home again. So what was supposed to be a 48-hour trip ends up being five years abroad in exile. And some of these people are joining the Shetland Bus later. Some are staying on in the UK, working as regular fishing men and helping supplying the UK with food, especially from the port of Bucky north in Scotland for the remainder of the war. In the late 1940s, you see this picture here. You can see the first real operation during even, this is still the Section D days. And to the left, to the right, sorry, you see a man with a too short tie and a suit and a hat, which is Chavrot Musters, which was one of the first leaders of the Norwegian section of the SOE. He had worked in Norway up until the war broke out in Norway in April 1940 as a covert operator in Bergen. He was involved in gun running to Finland, for example, during the Winter War, and he was a very sort of eccentric Oxbridge, Cambridge-educated guy who was very interested in birds and did sort of tests of flying with hot air balloons to chase birds in Norway and stuff. We're talking about real birds, not the female version of the word. But he was he was a close friend of the son of Robert Falcon Scott, who went to the South Pole, etc. So it was a sort of an elite kind of UK. The other three guys are in the dungaree shirt is a Norwegian lay preacher man who was a theologist. A former whaler in the center, and then another Norwegian who crossed over in those May days in 1940. And these guys were sent on a sabotage mission late in May using a Danish fishing vessel and not a Norwegian one, which a Danish fishing vessel looks very different from a Norwegian one. So if it wasn't for the chaos that was in May 1940, it would be seen immediately as a strange boat coming into to Norway, and the Germans would know what this was all about. But they used the opportunity and managed to blow up a power station, which was sort of the first sabotage mission in Norway since the British Army retreated from the south of Norway in early May 1940. And this happened just about a month later. If you go to the next picture, you can see this Carsten Wang with the smoke there and the cat. He was the skipper of this boat, and he was this kind of you know, he had been doing booze smuggling in the Caribbean before the war, and so that was the sort of guy who they took to skipper one of the boats. And he, after one of the missions that followed that summer of 1940, he went home to his wife, and he was subsequently arrested and shot. So his fate was basically sealed by going home to see his wife after he'd been abroad at sea for several years before the war. In the next picture, please, you can see the odd one out. That is Kronberg, which was a Swedish guy who joined this team of operators in the early days. And he also suffered a sad fate, because when he returned to England after mission completed, he managed to shoot himself in South London after the mission was over, and so it disappears out of this history. But this is the kind of prelude to what was to follow. And by that time, the Shetland Bus isn't organized properly. They start organizing properly about November 1940 in what SOEs in the documents is called the Shetland Scheme, which is about to put up an organization that can ferry over couriers, agents, and so forth from the Shetlands over to Norway.
Okay, well, we've got a couple of questions about 1940 before we move on. So, well, Darren Little is saying, maybe this is for later on, did the bus ever go to Bodo? My grandfather was wounded at the airfield there, evacuated June 1940 whilst with the original independent companies.
No, they didn't go to Bodo, but they went to the area around Bodo. But because Bodo was basically flattened during the attack, the German attack in 1940, Bodo wasn't an area operation. They would mainly operate on the coastline and not too far in, far from cities and towns, etc. But they would use kind of small hamlets, barren places to get these people in, places where there were one or two houses and stuff. But they sailed north of Bodo actually during the operations. So Bodo wasn't the NI.
And then we have a comment ready from John. I love it when we have these connections with people watching who have a sort of a direct link to the stories we're covering. My grandfather escaped Norway on 9th of April 1940 during the German invasion. He was a merchant seaman in the last merchant convoy HN25 to leave Norwegian waters. And thank you, John, for putting that, because it's one of the reasons I do these shows live, because it's amazing how people around the world have little connections, either directly or indirectly, with these stories. So it's fantastic. So, but back to you. It's getting off to a good start. And I like the way you say that in 1940, it's more of they haven't really got a plan yet. It's more ideas, because that is the story of sabotage. Churchill basically says we should start doing stuff, and everyone goes, yes, we should start doing stuff, without really knowing what the stuff is they're going to do. That sort of starts happening over the next 2 or 3 years. And, I'm telling your own subject, but by sort of 44, everything's become a little bit more organized on almost regimental levels. But at the beginning, it's just people wanting to do anything, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it is also, and you can see that as well in the paper mill. In the early days, there are very few documents, and as the war progresses, there are more and more and more. And in the case of the Shetland Bus, I think it's a very sort of typical SOE case, in that in the beginning, the first season, because we divide the Shetland Bus operations into season. You have autumn until till spring, because Norway during the summertime is too light. There's nearly a light 24 hours a day, so it's very hard to do clandestine operation into a territory where everybody can see you. So they basically start running in December 1940 and carry on until through May 1941, and then August 1941 until April 42, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And then the main thing about the operations in the early days, I think it's very sort of typical of SOE, because, as you say, SOE starts up. Churchill said, "Set Europe ablaze," and then people are saying, "How are we going to do this? We need money, we need people, you need everything." And one of the things that I've found lately, which I didn't know when I was writing my book back in 2017, is that the finance aspect of all this is extremely important. Because in the first season, most of the people that are ferried over from Shetland to Norway, they are couriers, and in the SOE documents it says, they were a courier, this, that, and the other, and to the resistance movement maybe, or something like that. But you had no clue what this courier was doing. And then I found some archives later on, and I saw that these couriers were bringing along a substantial amount of money, and they were basically setting up a organization that could take Norwegians who wanted to join up from the west coast of Norway over to the UK with fishing boats. But to send those fishing boats over, you need fuel and you need money, etc. So it was much better finance from the UK than I hitherto thought. So that's an important aspect. Just briefly about Norwegian resistance, which develops obviously during the war, but Norwegian resistance in the beginning consists mainly of officers from the level of major downwards, that have been together in these war camps for about a month, from early May 1940 until mid-June 1941, when everybody were released to go home to the homes and farms and stuff, etc., to help with to bring in food for the summer and stuff like that. And when these people are gathered in these camps, they sort of start talking between themselves and saying we should do something. They don't know what. Some people have buried some rifles or some machine guns in the hillsides and stuff like that. And we say, we save this for a later day and until we find out what we're going to do. And this is very much what's happening in the first season, that, this fledgling resistance movement is starting to to build itself up. They don't have a central command yet, and this is coming over the first year or so. But it's gradually developing, and SOE is hooking into this fledgling resistance movement. Is starting to do operations and starting to help these people. And the main aim in the beginning is to try and build up local forces, so-called fifth columns, that can do guerrilla activity in the mountains and so forth, because Norway geographically is ideal for guerrilla warfare. You have a lot of sort of barren places and mountains, etc. So you can be in a valley where there's nobody there, and you can do weapons training, etc., without anybody seeing you. And it's not like today where you have, umpteen sensors from satellites downwards that can see you no matter what you do. And the iPhones in 1940 weren't very good as well. So that but the first season is a bit of try and fail. So there are in particular three things that I see in the first season. That one is this moving couriers from the UK to Norway. The second is SOE in Stockholm sends over a team that is supposed to go to Shetland. They get sabotage training in Shetland, go back to Norway, blow up a railway line, cross the border into Sweden, and are subsequently arrested. So that's a failure in terms of it doesn't have any impact on the war. And the third thing is mining operations of the inner lead, because the Norwegian coastline has the inner lead where most vessels are sailing between islands to be protected from the North Sea and the Norwegian Sea. So they lay this mine in the inner leads, but in terms of things that go bang, it's very limited in those early years, and it's only in 1942 that things are starting to get running as we know later. What we see in front of us now is obviously the Bank of Scotland building in Lervik. Today is Bank of Scotland, but on the second floor in that building was the headquarters of the Shetland Bus. It was ran by, this is also an outliner in the SOE history. It was ran by a guy called Leslie Mitchell, who became a major, and he was, before the war, an MI6 operator in both Berlin and in Oslo. So he had stayed in Berlin during the Nazi takeover and ran operations in Germany before the war. When the war broke out, he moved with his team to Norway, and he took part in the invasion in 1940 on the British side. And then he was appointed to head this Shetland Bus operation. And perhaps this background helps with the curious thing that the Shetland Bus ran operation both for SOE and for MI6 or SIS. Right. So in the case of SOE, it was these two or three people who were to build up a guerrilla band somewhere in Norway. And in the case of SIS or MI6, it was mainly the so-called coastal watchers. It was basically Norwegians who were taken from the UK, sent over to Norway, and were supposed to live in a cave for about half a year and watch shipping passing every now and then and report back to the UK. So the UK could send submarines or aircraft or whatever to attack these ships. So it was a very sort of lonely living for these agents who were sent over the boat. And also, I have to say in brackets, to add that MI6 also had an operation base in Peterhead in Scotland, where they ran their own boat operations to Norway. Right. So, but that was pretty limited. But we should know that there were kind of two Norwegian fishermen pools that were ferrying agents over from the UK to Norway, starting in December 1940. This is a picture of the MK motor cutter Mars, which was one of the early boats who left Norway just before Christmas 1940 and arrived in Shetland and became the first crew in the Shetland Bus. The guy you see up on the right corner is August Nærø, which was 20 years old and became eventually the skipper of this boat. It happened when the other skipper went on a failed mission with him as a crewman, and he just left the bus after the mission was completed because they were nearly caught by a German patrol boat, and he decided that he had to jump ship afterwards. And then he joined the merchant navy and sadly perished a few years later in a convoy in the Atlantic, I think it was. But this is very typical for the early Shetland bus. They had very little screening on the personnel. They didn't have any particular training in the early days. And they took these crews as they came over and put them back again, gave them a couple of Sten guns, maybe a Bren gun, and said, you're going to take this bunch of guys over to Norway, and good luck to you, fellows. And a lot of the guys who joined up in the early days, or several of the guys who joined in the early days, they went on maybe one trip, and then they said, this job is not for me, and I have to lead the organization and go to do something else. And you can understand that, because there was an enormous amount of pressure to cross into behind enemy lines without any training. And then the real training in the Norwegian section starts in March 1941, sorry. And it's interesting because all the Shetland bus guys are doing the same training, including parachute jumps, that the regular SOE guys are doing. And you have to remember that most of these guys had 7 years of schooling. When they became 15 years and after their confirmation, they went to sea and started fishing, which was a very sort of respectable way of living, especially if you could catch a lot of herring. You would made the killing when you were young, 15 years old and making several thousand kroners. It would be, it's an amazing thing, even compared to today in terms of the relative income you would have. And these people were not used to walking along the shore, and they would stay on the boat, and we had this back and forward style of walking, almost like you see in the old Western movies when people have been riding horses for too many years. And I spoke to one of the guys who's now passed away, but there were only 3 left when I spoke to the guys, and he told me when they had to do this final exercise under the training section, they had to do a 30-mile walk, on time limits. And when I spoke to him, he was well into his 90s, and he said, it's the most damnable thing I've done in my life. Even the missions where you're considered light compared to that long march you had to do under the SOE training program. So it became better with the years, and this training was obviously a kind of selection, but the amount of Norwegians who came over from 1940 until say mid 1941 was a bit limited. But then all this fleet of escapees starting to arrive, and the pool is better. And another type of Norwegians who joined in the early days were former whalers who had come to the UK from the Antarctic whaling season, and were told by signal that they should go to an Allied harbour. And they went to the UK and spent the summer of 1940 in the UK before they joined up, some of them. But a fascinating thing I heard from an old guy who was the son of the Norwegian Minister of Defense during the Second World War. He said, these whalers came from the Antarctic and they had an enormous amount of money among them. And they were based in some camp in Scotland, and they went to a pub in Scotland and started drinking, obviously. And when the bell rang at 11 for last orders, or just before 11 for last orders, they said, what, are you closing now? And the landlord said, of course I'm closing. It's nearly 11. And he said, how much do you want for this pub? And he gave them a price, and they just took up the money and put it on the table and said, we're buying this pub. And they continued drinking until dawn the next day. So they just bought the pub. And these are the kind of men who joined the SOE Norwegian section in the early days, but later on it was more professionalized. But
that's the story of SOE and Parachute Regiment and SAS. It's the early people are always just sort of the oddballs almost, and it's like, oh, I know someone, he could do that, and you ask a friend. Then later on, the organizations always become a little bit more streamlined, and it's the characters you see in the first years is that kind of what was the nucleus of these very professional organizations. Is just almost like crazy idiots, and I mean that in a very complimentary way, the kind of resourceful, ambitious people. But amazing story, we're loving it.
And also you have obviously people from all walks of life, which I think also is a great. You have a fellow who joins the Norwegian sort of land section or the company Linge, which is an architect, and he's working together with this guy he's a former Boy Scout platoon leader, and you have all these sort of different people who are coming in at the same time, and they managed to do things as well. Even very scarce resources, because things doesn't start to run very well until, as I said, 1942. Then it becomes more like a machine. You see everything is in place. The services are coming up from Aberdeen to Shetland. They're building another base in the north of Scotland to help with the supplies. And the people who are there are more stable. They've been through things before, and they've gone on several missions. And also they take, as we can see later, if you move on a bit in the slides, we can see the next slide perhaps. You can see the guy top right on the cabin of the fishing vessel there. He's called Bård Grotley, and he is a classic fisherman character. Came over in 1940. There was an SOE agent, one of these couriers, who paid him a lot of money to ferry over himself and another guy, and he remained in Shetland afterwards. And he would go on these missions to the far north of Norway, because they would get bonuses to go. The further north you went, the more bonus you would have. So if you went just across from Shetland to Bergen, say, which is about 24 hours, or the area around Bergen, you would get a bonus on £5. Further north, you would get £10, and then to the far north, you get £20, which was a lot of money at the time for these guys who weren't earning that much money. And that guy, Bård Grotley, on one of his trips, he went to his local grocery store back home, and he ordered an accordion, and then he sailed on for his mission. And then he remained in the north of Norway for a week, drinking booze and celebrating with the local people. And then he picked up the accordion on the way back to Shetland. So, they took some diabolical liberties as well. But that was the thing about these men. They were not men that were, put into sort of a military order. They were doing their thing. And they even sort of built up their own network along the coast, from the locals to help them. So they would bribe them with a bit of coffee and flour, etc., and a bit of money in some cases. But they had these local helpers. They built up their own network, and basically that's interesting from the point of view of the Leslie Mitchell as well. We was the boss up at Lervik. He let the guys. He understood these guys. He said, they have to have these liberties to do what they want. They can't, be put into a sort of strict naval regime that they're going to every morning. They're going to stand to order and listen to the sound of the bugle, etc. So they were sort of free men in terms of, and they had always been free men since they started fishing at the age of 15 or something like that.
Yeah.
So this is Lunabo, which became the headquarters or the main base in 1941-42. It looks exactly the same today. If somebody goes to Shetland, I know in the UK in particular, Shetland's become popular because of the TV series called Shetland in the later years, and Lunna is a very sort of ideal hideout for clandestine operations. There are hardly anybody living there, and it's on the east coast of Shetland. It's relatively close to Norway, or so they thought. And what it turned out to be was that the waters are very problematic. There's no natural harbor, so you can't sort of dock the ships into a harbor and maintain them and stuff like that. So they remained in Lunna for about one season, and they moved on to another place called Scalloway on the east coast of Shetland, which is a very charming fishing village, which people could also have a great time when they were off duty and live amongst other people. What was in particular with Lunna was that these guys obviously had a massive amount of ammunition. That they did shooting training obviously in the hills around Lunabo, and there were quite a few sheep who were killed during live fire exercises, which the local farmers had to get paid for during this boring months in Lunabo when nothing was happening outside. This is a bit of a particular Norwegian fishing boat. It's not a particular, not a classic one, but this boat Urkna did a few missions, but it was built. It was built from steel and not from wood, which you said. If you go on to the next boat, perhaps. Sorry, one back again. So this is taken in Scalloway, obviously, and you see, you know, the layout of a Norwegian fishing boat. They are very distinct, and you see the back end of the boat is kind of rounding up, and the sails, obviously. So
yeah.
So this is what a Norwegian fishing boat looked like with the iron version, but we will see the others made of wood later. They were about sort of 50 to 60 feet long, so that's the sort of size of them. They're not, you know, in today's today's fishing vessels are, you know, massive.
Industrial fishing today.
Yeah.
This is yeah.
But this was a backbone of Norway, the fishing fleet, back before the war and even after the war, well into the 1950s. You would see these kind of boats, and this Urkna is actually still around today, and it recently went on a voyage to Shetland together with 4 other vessels that took part in the operations during the war. So there are all in all 4 vessels that are still up and running 80 years later, which I think is
brilliant.
Pretty fascinating. Yeah. Any questions before we move on?
No, we're good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just got to focus on a couple of operations which are sort of famous or half famous from the Shetland Bus. Operation Archer happens in December 1941. SOE decides to send in a team of 4 guys to do a combined operation with sabotage in connection with the second Lofoten raid operation. Second Lofoten raid. Which took place between Christmas and New Year 1941, and these 4 guys were sent to the far north of Norway. It was, you know, several days sailing from Shetland to get there. And if you see the guy to the left, who was the team commander, and the guy with the green frame, both of these 2 guys were former whalers, as I mentioned earlier. And the 2 other guys were from the area in North Norway, so they knew the terrain better. So the setup was a bit problematic, perhaps. But, you know, these were the furthest missions that the Shetland Bus had done so far and it's pitch dark in North Norway in December. You know, it's 24 hours darkness, so you can't see anything, and you know, the weather is extremely harsh. And these men came ashore, and they had to walk up a sort of mountainside, which is kind of, you know, it's not exactly the scene in the Guns of Navarone when they climbed the cliff, but it's not far away, at least in terms of the weather conditions, which was, you know, very harsh. And then they were supposed to do sabotage in connection with that second Lofoten raid, and the Shetland Bus also took part in the second Lofoten raid. And they were supposed to go in the inner leads and sabotage various objects on the way to Lofoten, but this was a complete failure because the engines broke down along the way. And when they came to Lofoten, some of the boats, the commandos had already left Lofoten, etc. So in the beginning, it wasn't a very sort of successful operation. And most of the Norwegian section before these guys, they are more or less as a commando force. They do this raid. You had earlier a couple of episodes on Operation Claymore, I think it was, in Lofoten, the first raid. And the second raid was much less spectacular because all the Germans had basically left Lofoten by the time they came, so they were just treading water in Lofoten for a few days before they were evacuated back to the UK. And this is one of the so-called. It later changed name to Operation Heron, and it became one of the longest-running operations in Norway, and it lasted from December 1941 until well into 1944, when it was called Operation Falcon.
Right.
And and here you can see this is also an illustration from the even further north. It's the boat of Heland. This is taken from the lens of one of the SOE operators in Lofoten. It wasn't a successful operation either, but this was at the, you know, in the middle of 1940, or in 1942, it was the farthest north they've gone with this vessel, and it was a sailing that took, you know, nearly a week to get back and forth. So they went really far north, you know. So this is sort of a picture taken in 1942 from the lens of one of the agents SOE sent into Norway.
Brilliant.
Karl Johan Aarsæter is one of the sort of classic Norwegian SOE operatives. He did his first mission already in the autumn of 1941. He came over as a courier to establish connection with the local resistance in the area around Ålesund. And then he would come back and forth to Norway. I think at least 4 times he was ferried over by the Shetland Bus back and forth from Norway. And he was very important in that he managed to build up an operation which was called Antrim, which lasted from 1941, basically early 1942, late 41, until the end of the war. And that there was a classic SOE operation where they managed to build up a massive guerrilla organization in the hills of Norway. And they were training. They had problems, but they had also infiltrated the local German police, the Gestapo, etc. And they knew most of the places and most of the people, and they could operate pretty freely for several years, although they had some minor setbacks. But you know, and also there were 1 or 3 brothers who joined the SOE from his Norwegian section, and he was a very sort of familiar face to all the crews because he went so many times. But most of the agents and the crews never talked to each other in terms of real names, etc. So they would put somebody over, they wouldn't know his name, because if they were to get arrested, they could say the name of the agent, and then they could trace them, etc. So there was a sort of need to know basis during the entire war. And I also, when I interviewed one of the guys several years later, he told me about one guy, and we're talking, you know, 75 years after, and he didn't even know the name of the agent 75 years later until I told him from the document what he was actually called. So they remain sort of under wraps for years and years, many of these guys. But obviously some of them kept in touch after the war as well, because they had sort of veteran clubs, etc., where they would meet up. But you know, mostly in some cases people wouldn't know who had ferried over, even, you know, nearly 75 years later.
We had a question just come in about essentially the cover stories. I mean, these are boats coming from Shetland. So if a German patrol boat stops them, can they say they're fishing? Can they get away with it in that way? Or, you know, we're thinking of Guns of Navarone again. you got that in my head. It's your fault. How would that work?
Yeah, it would work if you crossed, because the Germans changed the policy of fishing. There was a limit on 30 miles from the coast.
Right.
So any vessel that sails outside of that limit is suspicious, because they're not supposed to go that far out. But once you cross that limit and are in the fishery zone, you're basically more or less safe, because fuel limits, etc., would also be a problem. But one of the challenges is that these guys had to sort of pretend they were fishermen. They went dressed in uniform. They always wore fishing gear and had nets on the boats, etc. And they used also the oil drums on the boat for hiding Lewis guns. So there was this sort of mechanism that was developed that you took off the lid of the oil drum, and then the Lewis gun would pop up, and you could sort of shoot down enemy aircraft, which became very much of a hassle starting from 1942 onwards, when nearly half of the crews died on missions, also because of weather, but also due to German attacks.
Right. Yeah. There's a couple of doubled photos in there. The next one that's different is where are we?
Yeah. Sorry.
No, this one. There we go. Yeah. Scalloway.
Yeah. This is just this became the home of the Shetland Bus from the summer of 1942 onwards, and the connections were with the locals were extremely close and have remained so until this very day. You know, there are a lot of Norwegians going over even now to visit, also relatives of people who were in the bus. There were about 10 marriages, I think, between members of the Shetland Bus and local ladies in Scalloway. And you know, the connection was very. You also have to remember that most of the men in Scalloway were away for war in other theaters, you know, at the time. So
yeah, true. Yeah, good point.
There were a lot of brawls between the Norwegians and the Scottish soldiers who manned the coastal guard, you know, at the time as well. But you know, by and large, Scalloway made life easier in for them because you know, in the summer of 42, 43, there is a saying that 50% of the beds of the Shetland Bus guys were empty because they had died on missions. And 42, 43 is really the big turning point. And I can say a few words as to why, because you speak to Jan Tore, I think, tomorrow about the MTBs. And there is a bit of a sort of overlap there because when the MTBs started being more aggressive and attacking, you know, German shipping in the inner lead and in these places that the Shetland Bus used to roam alone, the Germans became much more aware. Secondly, the Germans started to build after the second Lofoten raid and also a bit after the first day. They started to build this massive protective wall along the Norwegian coast called the Atlantic Wall, which you see in France as well, which was part of the same thing. It basically went from France up to the very northern end of Norway, along the coast of these coast fortresses and watching posts and everything. And there was also a lot more sort of German patrol aircraft who went far out to sea and looked for these boats who were coming over. And in some cases, I think there was also some might have been some radio penetration from the German side that they would hear something was going on the other side through the signals listening post, etc. It's a subject that is a bit hard to get into because the documentation is very limited on the German side. But these four things made life much more difficult for these slow-moving vessels, and the need for something else and faster became very apparent. If we can move on to the next one, I think that's this is just an image which shows one of these rare cases where Rørholt, the guy in the white overcoat, he is an MI6 operator, and the two guys to his to our right are SOE guys. So it's the only known case where MI6 and SOE sent guys on a mission with the same boat, as far as I know. At least on the Norwegian section, I haven't seen it in other sections as well. I think, as far as I can remember. But so this is a sort of unique moment when they say, you know, it used to be a saying that, you know, SOE and MI6 never cooperated to a great extent, but in the case of the Shetland Bus, they really did. You know, this was a place where agents for both, both MI6 and SOE went to Norway.
Brilliant stuff.
So this is the kind of the most famous operation that the Shetland Bus ever did. What we are seeing under these trees and hidden along the shores is the what they used to call the beast, is the Tirpitz, one of the great German battleships, and it was laying in a small fjord inside central Norway, not too far from Trondheim. And the British started planning this operation already in March 1942 to sink the Bismarck with underwater torpedoes, which were manned by frogmen. This is obviously an idea the British took and nearly copied from the Italian grease operators.
Borrowed. Yeah, we borrowed it.
From the grease operators in Alexandria in 1941, I think it was. And this is an image taken during training. You can see the equipment is pretty fancy to be back in 1941, 42, I think. And the idea was to tow with one of the fishing boats to tow underwater torpedoes, one on each side, held up by two sort of wires on either side, and go into the fjord and put this man on the sea and attack the Tirpitz when he was lying in Norway. The only problem was that SOE started planning this, and I think it's very interesting because we always look at this operation from the start, when they start moving into Norway and starting the attack, etc. And forget how much planning and dry runs they did beforehand. And just to give an example how serious this was, that during the summer of 1942, the SOE sent 3 fishing boats from Shetland via the Caledonia Canal in Scotland and down to the west coast of Scotland to test out these systems. And they did dry runs against the HMS Rodney, which was a British battleship. So they had really tested that this thing could work, in Scottish waters, and they knew that the concept worked, and they could get the torpedoes in on the Rodney and sort of demonstrate that it was possible.
I think that sort of preparation and aspect is often forgotten. I think, particularly us Brits, we like to think it's always just like some plucky guy going into an office and say, I've got an idea, and like taking a gadget he made in his shed and just going. And actually, although there's a sort of elements of truth to that, this is the era when, there's fighting in North Africa, but, we're well before the Second Front, where there's lots of preparation. There's courses happening up and down the UK, across the empire. There's a lot of thought being put into this stuff. It isn't just, crazy people with ideas they've written on the back of a napkin in a restaurant. And I think that gets overlooked, that there's so much preparation. And it's not anybody's fault that sometimes by the time the research is done, the strategic situation has changed. So maybe the thing you've been planning for has to evolve into something else. I mean, I'm thinking about things like Operation Freshman and the heavy water. Is that the situation keeps changing? They plan things and then, oh, hang on, it's changed again. Reminding ourselves how professional these organizations are attempting to be, I think, is important. So thank you.
Yeah, it is very important, because I think, when you read the documents and see the amount of plannings and dry runs that were done, and which vessel to use, why was it the Arthur and not the Andholmen, etc. And they did these dry runs with several vessels and tried out, is this better and this better? What about the weather? How could we get over? And so on. And then when the operation finally gets okay, because it's proven, they start off from Lunabo, which we talked about earlier, because it's a barren place, as I said. There's nobody knows about this operation. They do some diving tests before they take off, and then the wireless, these coastal spies in Norway, which MI6 runs, they send over a wireless message saying that Tirpitz has gone north. So Tirpitz went out, sailed northwards to attack the Murman's convoys, and she broke out from the fjord where she's been lying for several months, and then goes on the attack. And then, everything say, okay, the operation is cancelled. We can't do anything as long as she's in the Norwegian Sea, on the Barents Sea, attacking convoys. And then, lo and behold, in late October 1942, the message, the message that is sent on a wireless is that the beast is back, and she's moving back into position in Trondheim to be protected. The mission is on, and they sail out with these torpedoes on deck to begin with. And then they reach a point in Norway where they lower the torpedoes with the wires on the ship side and go into the Trondheim fjord, which is guarded by patrol boats. Every boat that passes through has to be stopped and show papers, which they obviously have, in ways of false documentation. And they comment with this brilliant that all the fragments are in the storage room of the fishing boat, and they have a pile of peat above them. So they're saying they're transporting, the winter is coming, we're transporting peat to local populations so it can be warm during the winter time. And one of the Germans, as they are closing into the patrol boat, the German patrol boat, to show the papers, one of the German sailors is just looking down in the water, and one quick-minded Norwegian just takes, the rope and just throws it in his face. So we have to look up, and then obviously you can't see that there are 2 torpedoes hanging on the ship side. So they managed to lure themselves past the German patrol boat, and they are basically on a free home run to the position where they're gonna lower the frogmen into the water of the fjord, and the frogmen are going to attack the turpets. And then when they are carry on sailing, the weather is changing a bit. There's a bit of a wind coming in, and all of a sudden they can hear something, that really makes the boat sort of go up and down quickly. And they dress up one of the frogmen to go down under and see what about the torpedoes. And he goes under the boat, and he can see that, both the torpedoes, the wires have snapped. Both the torpedoes are gone to the bottom of the fjord, which is several hundred meters deep. And obviously the mission has to be abandoned.
Yeah.
And they sink the Arthur, the boat they used, the fishing boat, and they managed to get to shore just about 2 o'clock at night on the 1st of November 1942. And when they reached the shore, the Norwegian winter is already setting in. There was no global warming back in 1942 because it was very harsh winters in Norway during the war. And they decide to follow the original plan, which is to head for Sweden. A neutral Sweden is the safe house. They had to walk several kilometers to get to Sweden, and then they divide the party into 2 groups. There are 4 Norwegians and 6 British operators. 4 frogmen, British frogmen, and 2 helpers who are going to dress them up, etc. So they divide this group into 3 Brits and 2 Norwegians, and one group had south and the other one had northwards. So they're not to be caught. And the group that goes the southerly direction manages to get pretty straight ahead to Sweden. Okay, they suffer some quite severe frost bites on the march to Sweden, but they're not caught by the Germans. They're not seen by anyone. The local helpers, the local Norwegians who are they're knocking on doors, on barns, etc., helping them along the way. The other group, which is headed by Leif Larsen, the legendary skipper of the Shetland Bus, also manages to get pretty close to Sweden. And then I drove this road. We can go over, if you go on a couple of slides, you see. They get to this place, which is about, I will say, about 10 k's from the border to Sweden. And they're coming along the bend, walking towards where the photo is taken from in the middle of the night. And there is 2 Norwegian policemen coming out and walking in the opposite direction, and they are subsequently arrested. And then Larsen shouts in English to one of the British guys, draw your gun, and he does, and there's a shooting, and most of the group manages to escape, apart from the frogman Robert Evans, who is shot and later dies. Is brought to hospital and is later executed by the Germans. And after walking through this terrain, if you move on one picture again, you can see this is taken in early. Just another one, please. This is taken in early September, and you can see this is the Swedish part of the border. They cross, even though they cross into Sweden. You have to imagine this terrain with sort of a nearly half a meter snow on it, etc. And you still have, when you cross into Sweden, you still have to walk for several miles to get to people. There's nobody living in this region of Sweden, so they managed to get to one of these sort of camping sites that there are still people living and are thus saved. And they suffer severe frostbite, but they make a sort of very heroic escape. And I suppose that's what the British like, these great escapes and all kinds of sorts.
And as you said earlier, the ideal geography of Norway for resistance activities then makes it a shitty environment if you're trying to escape. so France had the problem of, Normandy, there's nowhere where big resistance units can hide, but you're also never very far away from society, from farms, from food, from rivers. So yeah, it's apples and oranges. The benefits of the countryside are there, but there are also some really bad negatives as well. And when we talk about resistance in Norway, living off reindeer moss in the winters and things like that some of these people had to do it's a harsh environment. And I noticed you took your photos when it was nice and sunny. Well, sort of sunny.
Yeah, but this was basically I went to this place a couple of years ago, and what was fascinating is the picture I had of the bend, where they were caught. This is from the documents. You can actually manage to trace the actual place based on the reports that were written 80 years earlier. So I think it's amazing in terms, and it hasn't changed a lot anyway. Maybe it's a few new bird streets, etc. But apart from that, the landscape looks exactly the same, which I think is fascinating. And I think it's also an underestimated part of especially the SOE history. All this, the landscape and geography of the place. You can read about them, and if you read about the capture of Kreipe in Crete, for example, they had to bring him along the coast, and it's not, it's not like today you go this gorge, by yourself along with lots of tourists in Crete, or you get a taxi somewhere. But it's really hard going, and you don't appreciate how much hard going it was for these people. And one of the guys, if you carry on a bit, we can zoom in on Palma Björne. He got to Sweden in one piece, and he suffered severe frostbites and ended up staying in a hospital in Sweden for several months to be treated for frostbites after this heroic escape he did after the failed Tirpitz operation. Just for fun, I put on his scan card, just to see what kind of types this Shetland bus. If you move on one more, you see here, you can see he did 3 parachute jumps. Mondi is the mine laying operations, and you see also the brilliant sort of British way of describing personnel. Progress fair but rather slow in practical work, etc. So they would write this, and also with Björne they write later on that can take a drink, but he falls asleep in a chair in the corner, etc. So they were like, so you try to get an impression of these guys. They weren't highly educated. It's not some I feel that with sort of British SOE memoirs in particular, you see these Oxford guys who were caught in Crete or in Greece and have a degree in archaeology, and they can write brilliant memoirs. And these guys, if you find a diary, it's more and it was raining today and not tomorrow, kind of.
I remember talking to Kate Vigers again on her Mission France book a couple of years ago about the way the people that do the records and the interviews, the way they describe some of the SOE volunteers is sexist, classist, because they're just not from their world. As you say, they're from a world, the Oxford world, where they've had a certain upbringing and a certain way of doing things, and they meet someone from a different part of life with different sets of skills. They don't know how to rate them. How would an Oxbridge guy who's never left academia really understand how a naturally born fisherman understands navigation, in the channel? That it's an alien concept. They go, well, so that comment about but progress fair, his Latin's not coming on very well, So,
but I think also it's important for the listeners, because a lot of you guys are not from Scandinavia or Norway, and I think the greatest difference between the Scandinavian countries and the rest of Europe is that we are extremely egalitarian.
Yeah,
you could talk to the minister of the prime minister in a sort of casual way almost. It's not heard of that, apart from the king, perhaps, it's not heard of that you are not talking to anybody and not feeling free to say what you mean to anybody. And this was obviously a shock for the guys in the SOE and in the Norwegian section, because they weren't used to this kind of, 7 years of schooling, could hardly read or write, And then they come and tell the lieutenant, from the Royal Navy, you don't know what you're talking about because we do it this way, not that way, etc.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no,
the
culture clash is interesting. Yeah, no,
yeah, the culture clash is very interesting, but sadly there isn't very, there are traces of that in the archives, but there are a lot of aspects we lose along the
that's
way.
why I bring people like yourself on, because it's not just your grasp of the history. It's the fact you're explaining the nuance of the cultural differences. Whereas if I brought, if I dug up David Howarth and brought him back on and had him give his version, his would be a very British upper class from his world view of this, which wouldn't be wrong as such. It would just be from the perspective that I want to bring my viewers. You bring that insight of understanding it from that Norwegian Scandinavian point of view. So brilliant stuff. So yeah, let's keep on going. I'm enjoying this.
You can just go like this. Just something about the medal sheet of Palma Burma. He got awarded obviously after.
Okay, yeah, because we had a question about were they decorated, and I said yes, they were.
Yeah,
so
they were.
Yeah, brilliant stuff.
Here we are back to Antholmen, which was became a party. She had sailed in Iceland for a couple of years before she became a part of the Shetland Bus in 1942 in the summer. She's a bigger vessel. She's about 60 feet long, and she was a classical shark fisher before the war. We're used to hunt sharks, which were used for food back in the 30s. So it's not the kind of Jaws sharks, but it's sort of North Sea sharks, which were used for food, especially in the UK and France back in the 30s. She made several missions to the far north of Norway and also catered for the Archer operation, which we talked about earlier, on the Hera operation. And what is interesting with Antholmen is she is also newly refurbished and sailed this summer to Shetland again, and she's still sailing after all these years and in perfect shape. And she was only one of 4 ships that came that looked like her that survived the war. The other 3 were sunk in the season of the summer of 1942 or the season of 42-43.
Right.
So they suffered an enormous amount of loss in that season. And we can go on to the next one.
Yeah.
Here you see in the center is Leif Larsen, which is the legendary skipper from the Shetland Bus. I think it's twofold. Why is it legendary? Threefold. First of all, he was an amazing skipper. He was a bit older than the rest of the guys. He was born in 1906 and not in the 1910s that most of the other guys were. And he had served in the winter war in Finland before the World War II came to Norway. And he did a lot of Harriers escapes, the last one being the Tirpitz one, but he had done already 2 brilliant escapes before the Tirpitz mission. And after the war, he featured in a film that is called Suicide Mission in English. I think it's one of its 50s war film, where most of the guys plays themselves in the film. Yeah. So you get, if you look up a Suicide Mission on YouTube, there is a clip of about sort of 7 or 8 minutes that shows a scene when one of their boats is attacked, and it sort of gives you an idea how life on this fishing vessel were during the wartime. So we can go on. This is just a Bergholm which is featured in that film I just mentioned, The Suicide Mission, or Shetland singing in Norwegian, and it's worthwhile seeing because it's very close to reality. It's not one of these films. There's also a film about Market Garden, I think, from 1949 or something like that.
Yeah, there's The Glory. Yeah, and then there's the Norwegian one about the heavy water, isn't it?
Correct.
Made in 48 with the real guys, and it's a bit sort of stilted. It's a bit, you can tell they're not actors, but it's amazing insight because it's the real people doing it basically as they did it. And it's they're important little films to
and also important document of the era, because that's when they became famous and well known to the wider public, obviously. And a lot of Norwegians weren't aware of these what had they done during the war, etc. and it's all in the late 1950s. The literature starts coming out, and there are a few books, but not many. And I think this is also an interesting aspect, because I mean, there's a bit of cultural divide, or used to be at least, between the east of Norway and the west of Norway. The coastal Norwegians are much more independent, and you know, they're looking for this big catch in the fishing fields, and are much more sort of entrepreneurs that maybe you find on the peasants that lived in some, you know, mountain farm in the east, for example. So, and they knew about death as well, because it wasn't uncommon before the war that a lot of fishermen perished at sea during the regular fishing season.
Worth reminding. I mean, when I'm in Brittany, in France, you know, looking, as I always am, looking for World War II monuments. Among the World War II monuments, you find the fishing disaster monuments. You know, even as fairly recent as the 1970s and 80s, you'll just see, oh, this ship went down, and then the lifeboats that go out to try and rescue people. You get the same up of you know, the northeast coast in England. You get the, you know, the light. So it's that reminder that the sea is a dangerous place, whether or not there's war or not.
Yeah, and also because now, you know, say with these big trawlers, etc., you have today, you know, the sea has been tamed, if you like, you know. So and this, every fishing community, you know, around the North Sea, plus that they have these stories, even down in Spain, obviously. But I mean, this is something very universal in every small fishing community, and today, because everything is health and safety, we didn't forget how dangerous it was, even not in wartime. So it's so we can go on to the next one, and this is obviously one of the sub chasers, the Vigra. Obviously, during the 42-43 season, you know, casualty rates were about 50%, which is very high, and the crews didn't want to carry on to go with the fishing vessels, because they said they were too slow. It was too much aircraft patrolling, and they made fights with the German aircraft on patrol, etc. But they needed some other solution, and there were various sort of ideas on the drawing board. You know, there was even, you know, doing a sort of clandestine trawler which could do 20 knots, but looked like one of the Norwegian ones. You know, there wasn't a lack of idea, but eventually it was Donovan, the head of the O.S.S, who came up with an idea to supply the Shetland Bus with 3 sub chasers, which were operating down in sunny Florida off the US coast beforehand. And these were bought on keel from Florida to Belfast, and then changed around a bit. A bit of the gunnery was changed. The sinking mines were taken off, etc. And they could do well over 20 knots compared to 7, which was the max speed of the fishing boats. It's a revolution. And as one of the guys told me, you know, when we came into this, they even had, you know, ice machines inside the galley, you know. So they was, to come into this thing, it was, you know, a world I never knew. And this starts off in late 1943 and carries on until the end of the war. And this is when the Shetland Bus becomes the Shetland Bus. Because they could leave Scalloway, they would arrive almost bang on time in Norway, and with the speed and the air and the firepower they had, you know, the missions went, you know, like a clockwork. And the only sort of serious incident was the next one, if you go to the next picture. It was the Hessa. They look almost exactly the same, but the Hessa was bombed by some Canadian aircraft which was patrolling the North Sea, and they thought it was a submarine. So they dropped deep water bombs on it, and it was bent a bit and went for repairs for a long time. But nobody were injured. They didn't have a single casualty whilst they were operating the submarine chases. So this is when the Shetland Bus became the real Shetland Bus. It was a ticking clockwork. No matter what the weather, they could push further in the fjords in Norway as well. They didn't have to go on the outer islands and stuff to leave ammunition and people far away from population centers. So they became more daring. And this is when the tide is turning. More or less, this is the end of the story, if you want.
Well, and,
So,
and there's your books there.
yeah,
people
the
can
one
check out.
the one on the left is the sort of monologue, the big book about the Shetland Bus, which I wrote several years ago, and the other one about Bergholm I released just after COVID, which is a more sort of micro history on one of the boats,
Yeah.
fishing boats and the pre-war years, etc. So that's.
Well, I urge people to try and don't forget, folks. You can always use Google Translate and things these days. So so a couple of questions for you, really. The first is well, it's a comment, really. Is that you can see the progression of this idea. You know, you can see this. Okay, we're going to start off kind of doing what we're going to use the boats we've got, we're going to use the people we've got, and it's going to be kind of stealth based and secretive, and then by the end it's like, no, speed, we need speed, we need defense. You can see over just a few years, really, you can see the development, and that is very emblematic of what's happening with SOE and O.S.S globally. Is as we said earlier, it starts off with an idea. Even you could make the same thing to like the SAS or parachute forces. It's like, okay, we've got an idea. Now, how do we make this idea into something that is actually constructive and works and benefits the war? So, it's a real, microcosm of the way the Allies take ideas and make them work. But my real question, and I warned you I was going to give you this, is we get very excited about the bravery of SOE agents and the bravery of these crews. Obviously, it goes without question, but we are 80 plus years later. How, as a Norwegian historian, what was the impact of the SOE from your point of view in Norway? You know, the Shetland Bus, we're not criticizing it, we're just saying, what effect did it have on the German war effort? Can we analyze that?
Yeah, we can begin with briefly the beginning, if you want, because Norway, after the fall of France, Norway became this kind of testing ground for various British forces. You know, both the commandos, the Shetland Bus, building up resistance, etc. Because of the long coastline, which was very little patrolled, and there were very few German fortresses in the early days after the occupation. So Norway is a very important tool for testing ground. The other second point is that Hitler was obsessed with Norway. He called Norway the destiny area. You know, if Norway was to fall, he would lose the war, and we go back to the blockade from the First World War, etc. And that was an obsession with Hitler. And in particular, after the Lofoten raids in March and December 1941, Hitler thinks that Norway is going to be attacked. The second front is going to come through Norway. And the British obviously try to, feed that as well to the German war machine. That Norway is important. We do raids there, we do sabotage there, and hence Norway is important. But if you look at this very sort of cold strategic thinking, Norway becomes the sideshow already when the green light is given for Operation Torch in North Africa in 1942.
Good point.
And then North Africa, Sicily, etc. Italy takes over as the main area, and you can also see that in the amount of aircraft that is put over to SOE to fly to Norway. Is only in the late 1942 that there is sufficient aircraft to try to drop people with parachutes and not sending over with fishing boats. So I think, but strategically, what Norway does during the war, what is important to know about Norway is that these small operations headed by the SOE made the Germans believe that there was a possibility there was going to be a second front through Norway. Yeah. And it's very hard to see that if you look at the map, because Norway is cut off from Central Europe. And so what, we're going to go through Sweden and then to Denmark and then into Germany. It's a very hard way of getting into mainland Europe through Norway, no matter how you look. Or you go around the Baltics and down from there, from Poland. I said, I don't know. But the Germans really believed this. And that was why Norway was important. And after the first and second Lofoten raids, you never have fewer than 300,000 German troops in Norway.
Yeah, and that came up in the sidebar. Yeah, you said that. I like the fact you used the word obsession. You know, Hitler has that same thing about the Channel Islands, which we've been discussing on World War II TV. It's like, ridiculous numbers of bunkers and positions put there. But it's that age-old thing we talk about, that nothing happens in a vacuum. So what's happening in the Mediterranean? There are Germans in Norway and it's always about where both sides are using their resources. And if they could have moved, if the Germans had not wasted certain resources in one area, they could have put those resources in somewhere else where they might have had more of an effect. But it's like a chessboard, isn't it? There's movement on the right-hand side of the board that everyone's looking at, but there's a blocking position on the left that's causing the strategic decisions to be made. And I think that's where Norway comes into it. And
and also I think you have to remember that there were about 3 million Norwegians at the time, so you have basically 1 to 10 in a number of troops, which I think is
crazy.
A fairly substantial amount of troops compared to the local population.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And and it's been really fantastic talking to you about that. And the next thing is where do you think, because you move around the world and you're not just based in Norway, what are there any kind of breakthroughs going to be happening in Norway's views of World War II? I mean, are there perennial subjects that Norwegians talk about? We Brits, we're obsessed by Market Garden and the bridge too far at Arnhem. We're obsessed by the Battle of Britain. Americans, it's Midway. Is there something that is still the subject that if a group of Norwegian historians meet in a pub, is there one subject that is still the one that you're all divided about, or that you want to get to grips with?
I think the ones that isn't hardly been done anything about is most interesting is why did the Norwegian General Staff collapse so quickly in 1940? Right. And this is interesting because all the generals in 1940 were young officers just before Norway became independent from Sweden in 1905. And these guys were supposed to be the lieutenants and the captains in the great heroic Norwegian War of Independence in 1905, which never came. And when the war arrives at the doorstep, at least 3 of the division commanders just give up without fighting. And it's a fascinating story, which you have to get into the psyche of the general staff, and also why these guys are totally forgotten today. Nobody can name these 6 generals that were the head of the divisions anymore, and they're totally forgotten. And why did the collapse came? I think that's the biggest one. That isn't
okay.
The war as such, I think, is pretty well covered, but obviously there are nuances, there are new angles, there are new historiography theories that are coming along, but I think by and large we know but of course for local historians there's an endless amount of things that
we don't do too much of the what if and the alternate history things, but I feel that if there's one year where a difference could have been made that changes the whole way the war unravels, is not Norway in 1940 and the Lofoten and the France. If a few things had gone differently from all points of view, from the British point of view, the French point of view, Norwegian and German point of view, because that whole campaign kind of starts with like a massive great thing and then it sort of just fizzles out. It doesn't have a kind of a key moment, and I feel that there was I don't know what the change might have been, but I feel that there's a real potential for something to have happened there that changes everybody's thinking about how 1940 pans out. And
but I think also it's important to remember here that you had the Norway debate in Parliament, which basically brings along Churchill. But I mean, Norway, the disaster, the British disaster in Norway, basically drowns in the even bigger disaster in France a couple of weeks later.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's always been Dunkirk, it's always been France, and some Norway Navy thing or whatever. But Norway, in British culture, even you have the Norwegian blue in Monty Python, the parrot. You have Peter Cook being Sven in Swiss College. So Norway has always been this obscure thing in British culture, and I think that's part of it as well, because France has always been something serious, an old rival, etc. And Norway, as it was for most of the war, is the periphery of the Second World War. It is important because it binds up German troops, but apart from that, you know, it's a lot of local history mostly.
Yeah, well, that's exactly why we're doing this series, to get to grips with it, understand it more. So, well, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. So, folks, there's no show this evening. We've got 2 tomorrow. So, Jan Tore is on tomorrow talking about the MTB operations, which dovetails with this show. Very fantastic. And Tessa Dunlop is coming on in the evening to talk about memorialization. How do the British view World War II? Well, that's a subject that could go on for days and days, but I'm looking forward to them. As always, click like and subscribe. Visit my guests' websites, buy their books so they write more of them. So, but that's it from me. I'm off to the pub in Wistram this evening to meet up with James Holland, Al Murray, Alex Churchill, a few others, and have a couple of beers. That'll be good. So I'll see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.